She told him she couldn't have kids. 6 years later, he saw 2 little girls screaming, "Daddy," and his world stopped. Andrew Bennett was used to silence in his luxury sedan. He liked the hum of the engine, the feel of control beneath his hands, and the calm before another high-stakes boardroom negotiation. But today was different. His mother, Margaret, was sitting beside him in the passenger seat, gazing out the window with that quiet, knowing expression she often wore when she had something to say but chose not to. They were driving through a quiet residential neighborhood near the coast, a detour on their way to a regional tech summit where Andrew was expected to finalize another major acquisition. The mood was calm, the sky clear, the city unaware that his world was about to shift. As the car turned onto a quiet street lined with modest homes and flowering trees, Andrew suddenly heard something. Faint at first, high-pitched voices, calling out, but then louder, clearer, impossible to ignore. His brow furrowed as he leaned toward the window, catching a glimpse of movement behind the car. He told the driver to slow down. 2 small girls, around 5 years old, were sprinting after the vehicle. They were identical in appearance, both had bright blonde hair bouncing in ponytails, one wore a pink dress and the other a red one, and they both had sneakers on their feet. Their voices rang out again, higher and more urgent this time, "Daddy! Daddy, wait!" The car came to a stop. Andrew pushed the door open and stepped out slowly, completely stunned. He turned to face them as they approached, their little faces red from running, but eyes full of unmistakable joy and expectation. "Are you talking to me?" he asked, barely able to get the words out. They nodded eagerly, out of breath but smiling wide. Before he could say another word, he glanced back at the car, at his mother, and what he saw froze him more than the girl's words. Margaret was smiling. Calmly. Softly. As if this was exactly what she'd been expecting. He turned to her, confusion and disbelief twisting inside his chest. "Mom, what is this?" he asked, voice low, almost afraid to hear the answer. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she opened her door and stepped out into the sunlight, walking toward the girls with a gentleness that betrayed familiarity. She knelt down, opened her arms, and the girls ran to her like they had done it 100 times. Andrew stood there, speechless. The pieces didn't make sense. Why would they call him Daddy? Why would they know Margaret? And why was she not shocked at all? His mother finally looked up at him with eyes that had carried a truth for far too long. "Andrew," she said quietly, "they're yours." It didn't register at first. His brain tried to reject the words, rewrite them, rationalize them into something else. But when he looked at the girls, really looked, he saw it. The shape of their faces. The eyes. The slight curl in their smile. He saw himself. Everything else faded, the street, the summit he was supposed to attend, the polished image of success he had built. All that remained was the crushing weight of a truth he had never imagined: he had daughters. 2 little girls who had just chased down a car to call out to a father they had never met. And his own mother had known all along. The car ride that followed was silent, but not the kind of silence Andrew usually welcomed. It was thick, pulsing with questions he didn't know how to ask and answers he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. The girls had climbed into the back seat cheerfully, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to be picked up by a father they'd never met. Margaret sat next to him with her hands folded neatly in her lap, still calm, still quiet, her expression unreadable. Andrew gripped the steering wheel harder than necessary, knuckles white, his breath shallow as his thoughts raced far ahead of the road. They arrived at Margaret's home, a warm, well-kept house in the suburbs that he'd visited countless times, but which suddenly felt unfamiliar. The girls, Lily and Luna, Margaret told him their names, ran inside without hesitation, clearly comfortable, as though they had spent many afternoons there. Andrew followed slowly, his chest tightening as he stepped through the door. The house smelled like chamomile and old books. A toy bunny lay forgotten on the couch. Crayons were scattered across the kitchen table. Everything inside screamed of childhood and innocence, and yet he felt like a stranger walking into someone else's life. Once the girls were settled with a snack in the living room, Andrew turned to his mother, the weight of his confusion finally spilling over. "You need to tell me everything," he said, trying to keep his voice from shaking. Margaret nodded and gestured for him to sit down at the kitchen table. She made tea, like she always did when something was difficult, but this time he couldn't bear the normalcy of it. She began slowly, carefully. She told him about the day she saw Hannah, his ex-girlfriend, the one he had left 6 years ago in what he thought was a final decision. Margaret had gone to a local farmer's market when she spotted a woman who looked far too much like someone she used to know. At first, she wasn't sure. But then she saw the children. 2 girls, so identical, so familiar, it took her breath away. They were tugging at Hannah's dress, asking for strawberries, and when Margaret walked closer, there was no more doubt. It was Hannah. And those girls, they looked just like Andrew had at their age. She didn't approach her that day. She watched from a distance, uncertain, shaken. But the image haunted her. So she returned the following weekend. This time, she spoke. Hannah was guarded at first, unsure whether to trust her. But eventually, as the weeks passed, they met again. Over coffee, over short conversations while the girls played nearby. And little by little, the truth came out. Hannah had been pregnant when Andrew left. She hadn't known at first. And when she found out, she was terrified. Terrified he would reject her again, that he would say she was trapping him, that he'd walk away a second time. So she kept it to herself. She made the choice to raise them alone. She never asked for money, never reached out, never told a soul connected to Andrew, except, now, Margaret. Andrew sat still as stone as his mother spoke. He wanted to shout, to demand why she hadn't told him the moment she found out. But as he looked at her, he saw the emotion in her eyes. She had been carrying this truth for months, trying to find the right way, the right moment. And maybe, deep down, she hadn't told him sooner because she was afraid too, afraid of what he'd say, afraid he'd reject them the way he once rejected Hannah. "I didn't want to push you," Margaret said gently, breaking his thoughts. "But when I saw those girls, I knew you had to be in their life. You're not the man you were back then, Andrew. You've changed. You deserve to know them. And they deserve to know you." He covered his face with his hands, overwhelmed. His mind spiraled with images, Hannah, alone, scared, raising 2 babies while he had been building his empire, thinking he had left the past behind. But the past hadn't left him. It had just been waiting to be found, in 2 tiny voices calling, "Daddy," behind a car. He asked one final question that evening, voice low, almost broken. Is Hannah okay?" Margaret hesitated before answering. Then she looked him in the eyes and said, "No. She's sick, Andrew. That's why she finally let me talk to the girls about you. She's running out of time." And with that, everything inside him shifted. The guilt. The fear. The hesitation. It all collapsed under the weight of something stronger, the undeniable need to make this right, before it was too late. Andrew couldn't sleep that night. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, the room dark except for the dim city lights filtering through the curtains. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw their faces, Lily and Luna, smiling, breathless, running toward him like he was someone they had always known. But he wasn't. He hadn't been there. He hadn't changed a single diaper or kissed a scraped knee or sat through a sleepless night. He had missed 5 entire years of their lives, not because they were hidden from him, but because he had walked away from the one person who would have given him everything. The guilt ran deeper than any mistake he had made in his business life. This wasn't a failed deal. This was a fracture of something far more fragile. The next morning, with almost no rest and a heaviness in his chest, he made a decision he hadn't been ready for the day before. He was going to see Hannah. Not to demand answers, not to argue, but simply to look her in the eyes and say what should have been said a long time ago. He called Margaret, asked for the address, and told his team to cancel his schedule for the day without further explanation. For the first time in years, work didn't matter. Nothing else did. He drove himself to the apartment complex Margaret had described. It was modest, clearly older, the kind of building most people ignored as they passed by. The walls were faded, the steps chipped, and the nameplates on the mailboxes were worn thin. But it wasn't the condition of the place that struck him, it was the thought of Hannah living here, quietly raising his children alone while he had been sitting in penthouses and conference rooms. His chest tightened with every step up the stairs. He paused in front of the door, unsure what to expect, unsure what to say. Then he knocked. It took a few seconds before the door opened just a crack. Hannah's eyes appeared first, still the same rich hazel he remembered, still steady, but now surrounded by exhaustion. She opened the door fully when she saw him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. There was no anger in her expression, no dramatic reaction, just quiet surprise and something deeper, caution, maybe even sadness. "Hi," he said, his voice almost too soft to hear. "Can we talk?" She stepped aside and let him in without a word. The apartment was small, clean but cluttered with the gentle chaos of children, crayons on the table, a pair of tiny shoes near the door, cereal boxes stacked on the counter. It smelled like lavender and something slightly burnt, maybe toast forgotten in a rush. Hannah gestured toward the couch, and he sat while she stood by the window, arms crossed. "I wasn't expecting you," she said finally, her voice hoarse. "I wasn't expecting them," he replied, meeting her gaze. There was a long pause. Then she nodded slowly. "I know." He took a deep breath. "Why didn't you tell me?" She didn't answer right away. She looked out the window, the pale light catching the outline of her face. "Because when I told you I was pregnant, you left. You didn't even ask if it was real or what I needed. You were already gone in your mind before I finished the sentence. What was I supposed to do? Beg you to stay and be a father when you were already halfway out the door?" "I didn't know what to do," he admitted. "I was scared. I thought we weren't ready." "I was never going to be ready for this alone either," she said quietly. "But I did it anyway." He stood up slowly, his voice lower now. "I want to help. Not because I feel obligated. Because I want to. I need to." She turned to look at him then, eyes searching his. "They're not just a problem to fix or a duty to fulfill. They're people. Little people who've built a life without you. You can't just drop in and expect to belong." "I don't expect anything," he said. "I just want to start." There was a tremble in her lip, and she pressed it into a firm line. "You're late, Andrew. But maybe not too late." They stood in silence for a few moments, not enemies, not quite friends. Something unspoken passed between them, regret, hope, fear, and the beginning of something unsteady but real. Just then, the door to the bedroom creaked open, and two identical faces peeked out, wide-eyed and curious. "Mommy," one of them said. "Is Daddy still here?" Hannah looked at them, then back at Andrew. "Yes, sweetheart," she said gently. "He's still here." And Andrew, for the first time, realized what that word really meant, not a title, not biology, but presence. And now, he was here. The days that followed blurred into a series of cautious, emotionally charged moments as Andrew began slowly integrating into the lives of the daughters he had never known. He didn't rush anything. He didn't arrive with gifts or grand gestures. He simply showed up every afternoon after work, sometimes still in his suit, sometimes in jeans and a sweatshirt, depending on how much courage it had taken that day to walk through the same door. He never came empty-handed. Sometimes he brought fresh fruit, sometimes picture books, sometimes nothing but his own uncertain energy. Hannah never stopped him, never pushed him away, but she also never made it easy. She observed quietly, always watching for signs that he might once again step back into his old pattern of avoidance. The girls, Lily and Luna, were both cautious and curious. They asked a lot of questions, some innocent, others piercing. One afternoon, Luna asked him if he had always known about them. The question was simple, but it hung in the air like smoke. Andrew knelt down to her eye level, looked her straight in the face, and said, "No, I didn't. But I wish I had." She didn't say anything else after that. She just nodded slowly, walked back to the couch, and went back to coloring. That was the moment he knew the repair wouldn't come from words, it would come from showing up over and over, with nothing expected in return. He started helping with daily routines. He'd read stories before bed, badly at first, stumbling over voices and pacing, until the girls started correcting him with laughter. He cooked, with comically mixed results, pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, pasta that came out too soft, and sandwiches cut into crooked hearts. But they loved it, not because it was perfect, but because it was his effort. And effort, to them, was love. Hannah stayed in the background most of the time. She watched from the kitchen while pretending to clean, her eyes betraying more emotion than her words ever did. She was tired, exhausted, really, and some days she could barely stand for long without needing to sit down. Andrew noticed. He didn't comment on it, not directly, but he began picking up more and more of the slack, folding laundry without being asked, offering to walk the girls to preschool when her joints were too stiff in the mornings, sitting with her in silence after the kids were asleep just so she didn't have to be alone with her fear. One evening, after the girls had fallen asleep in a tangled pile of stuffed animals and storybooks, Hannah finally let her guard slip a little. She was curled up on the worn armchair, a blanket draped over her legs, her face pale under the warm glow of the lamp. Andrew was washing dishes in the kitchen. Without turning around, she spoke. "You're different now." The words were soft, like a thought accidentally said out loud. He dried his hands and came to sit across from her, not breaking eye contact. "I wish I had been like this then," he said. "Wishing doesn't change the years I spent scared and alone," she replied, her voice steady but quiet. "But I see what you're doing now. And the girls, they see it too." He nodded. "I'm not trying to undo the past. I just want to give them a present they can rely on." There was a silence between them that didn't feel heavy, it felt necessary. A moment to acknowledge the space that still stood between them, even as it began to slowly shrink. Eventually, she looked at him again. "You know, they think the world of you already. It scares me how fast they've let you in." "It scares me too," he admitted. "Because I don't want to fail them. Or you." "You will," she said without hesitation. "Everyone does. But now at least, you'll be here to fix it when you do." For the first time, a faint smile curved at the corner of her lips. Not a full one, but enough to let him know she didn't just see the man who had walked away, she also saw the one who came back and stayed. As the weeks passed, Andrew fell into the rhythms of their home. The girls started calling him Dad without even noticing they were doing it. They argued over who would sit on his lap first, asked him to braid their hair before school, and insisted he help pick their bedtime songs. Every moment was new, raw, and unfamiliar to him, but he welcomed it. He didn't need control anymore. He needed connection. One night, as he tucked them in, Lily wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered, "I'm glad you're here now." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't part of a big conversation. It was just a child's truth, offered quietly. And for Andrew, it meant everything. Hannah stood in the hallway, unseen, listening. Her eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall. In that moment, she didn't feel quite as alone. The man who had once abandoned her was gone. And in his place stood a father who was finally ready to fight for his place, not through words, but through every small, deliberate act of love. Hannah's health began to decline more rapidly than any of them had expected. It started with small things, her needing to rest more often, missing mealtimes, and occasionally struggling to get through sentences without catching her breath. At first, she tried to hide it, brushing off the fatigue with excuses like a poor night's sleep or stress from the kids. But Andrew noticed. He always noticed now. What once would have gone unseen in his former world of business meetings and phone calls was now the center of his universe. The subtle shift in her tone, the stiffness in her movements, the way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking. He convinced her to go back to the doctor, to get updated scans and blood work. He offered to pay for everything, not as a gesture of guilt, but out of genuine fear and responsibility. She agreed reluctantly, only after realizing that avoiding it wouldn't change what her body was already trying to tell her. The results were sobering. The autoimmune disease was progressing faster than expected. Her immune system was weakening more rapidly, and her body was beginning to shut down in ways that even the best treatment could only temporarily delay. Hannah took the news with a quiet strength that unnerved Andrew. She didn't break down. She didn't scream or cry. She just sat in the clinic's small consultation room and nodded, as though she had already known this would happen eventually. Andrew, on the other hand, felt like the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. As the doctor laid out the plan for palliative care, possible options for extending her quality of life, and long-term support, Andrew couldn't hear anything except the deafening realization that he might lose her again, but this time forever. That night, after the girls had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Andrew sat with Hannah at the kitchen table. She held a mug of chamomile tea in her hands, though she barely sipped from it. The warm light made her look even more fragile, her skin too pale against the soft glow. He wanted to say something, to offer comfort or solutions, but everything felt inadequate. Finally, she broke the silence. "I'm not scared of dying," she said, not looking at him. "I'm scared of what happens to them when I'm gone." Andrew's throat tightened. He reached across the table and took her hand, something he hadn't done since they were together years ago. Her fingers were thinner now, colder, but still strong in their own way. "You're not going to face this alone," he said, and for the first time, he wasn't just offering support, he was making a promise. She looked up at him, eyes glistening but not crying. "They're good girls. They're kind and bright and stubborn. They need stability. They need someone who won't run when things get hard." "I won't," he said. "Not again." Hannah nodded slowly, almost as if she wanted to believe him but didn't dare to yet. "They already love you. I can see it. But if you're going to be part of their lives, you have to be their anchor, Andrew. Not just the fun parent or the one who shows up when it's convenient. They need to feel safe." He leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words settling heavily into his chest. He understood what she was asking, not just to show up, but to transform, to take on a role he had never prepared for. He had missed their first steps, their first words, their first birthdays. But maybe, just maybe, he could be there for what came next. He could give them a future with fewer absences. Over the next week, Andrew took action. He began to restructure his work schedule entirely. What used to be back-to-back meetings and constant travel was now tailored around pickup times from preschool, doctor appointments, and bedtime routines. His assistant was stunned by the shift. Board members questioned him. But Andrew didn't care. For the first time in his life, he felt like every minute spent outside the office was the right investment. He wasn't stepping back from success. He was stepping into his real legacy. He also began preparing legal documents with Hannah's guidance. They sat together late into the night discussing guardianship, education plans, medical directives, all the difficult conversations no parent wants to have but must when time grows uncertain. Hannah was meticulous. She wanted to ensure that no matter what happened, Lily and Luna would be safe, protected, and loved. One evening, as he tucked the girls into bed and read them their favorite story, Lily reached up and placed her small hand on his face. "Daddy," she whispered, "will you be here when I wake up?" He smiled, though his eyes were wet. "Always," he said. "Every morning." She nodded, satisfied, and rolled over. Luna, already half asleep, mumbled something about dreaming of dragons. Andrew sat there long after they had fallen asleep, watching them breathe, listening to the quiet rise and fall of their chests, and thinking about how precious it all was. These moments, the quiet, simple ones, were the ones he used to miss. Now, he couldn't imagine anything more important. Hannah watched him from the hallway that night, leaning against the wall, her arms folded. There was a softness in her gaze that hadn't been there before. She saw the man he had become, not the one she had once lost. And for the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could let go when the time came, knowing that her daughters would never feel abandoned. Winter came earlier than expected that year, covering the city in a soft blanket of frost and slowing everything down. But inside the apartment, time seemed to be moving faster than anyone could hold on to. Hannah's condition grew more unpredictable. Some mornings she woke up with enough energy to bake muffins with the girls and laugh over spilled flour. Other days, she couldn't make it out of bed without assistance. Her body was fighting, but the fight was uneven, and they all knew it. The reality of her illness had gone from background noise to something they all navigated around like a piece of delicate glass threatening to break. Andrew, now fully entrenched in their lives, had taken over most of the responsibilities. He woke the girls up for school, packed their lunches, braided their hair, though not always symmetrically, and made sure homework was done even when they protested. He had become more than a visitor or a surprise in their lives, he had become a constant. The girls had stopped hesitating when calling him Dad. It came naturally now, even when they were upset or sleepy, and he felt a quiet ache in his chest each time they said it, knowing how much of their beginnings he had missed but also how much they were letting him in anyway. Hannah watched it all unfold with a bittersweet sense of peace. She had fought so hard to shield the girls from the chaos of instability and disappointment, and now, with every passing day, she saw how safe they felt in Andrew's presence. It wasn't just the way they laughed more or how they rushed to show him their drawings, it was the trust in their eyes when he promised he would be back, and they believed him. Trust wasn't something you could teach a child to give. It was earned, piece by piece, moment by moment. One cold afternoon, when the sky was low and gray and snow had started to fall softly outside, Hannah asked Andrew to sit with her while the girls played in the next room. She looked pale and thinner than usual, wrapped in a blanket on the couch, a mug of peppermint tea resting in her lap. Her breathing was slower, and her movements more cautious, as if her body was reminding her of its limits with each step. Andrew sat beside her, silent at first, knowing this wasn't just a casual conversation. "I've been writing letters," she said quietly, not looking at him. "One for each of their birthdays. Until they're 18. He didn't speak immediately. His hands clenched slightly in his lap, the idea of those unread letters slicing through his heart. "They'll forget my voice eventually," she continued. "But maybe this way they won't forget how I thought of them. What I wanted to say, even if I'm not around to say it." Andrew swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay composed. "They won't forget you, Hannah." "They might," she said, finally turning to him. "Time does that. And I don't want them to be angry with you. When I'm gone, you'll be the one explaining everything. You'll be the one answering the hard questions." He nodded slowly, his throat tight. "I'll tell them the truth. But I'll also tell them how strong you were. How much you loved them. How you built their entire world without ever asking for help." She reached for his hand. "Promise me you won't disappear. Even if things get hard. Even if they push you away sometimes, or you feel like you're not enough." "I promise," he said, without hesitation. "I'm not asking you to replace me," she whispered. I'm just asking you to keep them whole." Later that evening, as the girls helped decorate the small Christmas tree with plastic stars and homemade paper chains, Andrew watched from the hallway. He listened to their laughter, their high-pitched excitement over which branch should hold the paper snowflake. And then he looked at Hannah, sitting quietly in the corner, her smile faint but filled with something deeper than joy, acceptance. She was beginning to let go, not out of defeat, but because she was finally certain she could. He saw that in her eyes. The fear that had lived behind every decision, every guarded word, had started to ease. She was giving him her trust, piece by piece, just like the girls had. And in return, Andrew gave her what he had never given anyone before, not a promise of perfection, not a solution to every problem, but unwavering presence. There was nothing heroic about what he was doing. No grand gesture would undo the years he had missed or the pain he had once caused. But love, real love, lived in showing up, again and again, especially when it was hard. And that was exactly what he was going to keep doing. The transition into the new year arrived quietly, with snow still piled on sidewalks and the days shorter than they should be. Life in Hannah's apartment had settled into a bittersweet rhythm, one shaped by quiet resilience and unspoken understanding. Though each day remained precious, everyone in the home understood that time was no longer a guarantee but a gift, one that could vanish without warning. Andrew now spent nearly every moment outside of work with the girls, and he worked less and less with each passing week. His business had taken a back seat not because he was abandoning success, but because he was finally defining it differently. Every morning began the same way. He woke the girls, helped them get dressed, packed their lunches with notes scribbled on napkins, and walked them to school hand in hand. They talked about everything and nothing, what color the sky was that day, whether fairies could survive in the snow, and what they wanted to be when they grew up. He listened closely, responding with a patience and warmth he never knew he had, learning slowly how to be the father they needed. In those conversations, he discovered what he had missed all those years, not milestones, but moments. Hannah, though weaker, remained the emotional heart of their little family. She rested more now, sometimes sleeping through entire afternoons, but she was always present when it mattered. On good days, she helped with homework or supervised messy art projects at the dining table. On bad days, she simply watched from her bed, her face both proud and aching as she listened to her daughters laugh in the next room. Andrew made sure she was never alone. He sat with her at night while she slept, brought her books even when she was too tired to read them, and memorized the sound of her breathing out of fear that one night it might stop. One evening, after putting the girls to bed, Andrew found Hannah awake, her eyes on the ceiling, lost in thought. He pulled a chair to her bedside and waited. After a few minutes, she whispered, "They're going to be okay, aren't they?" Her voice was steady, but Andrew could hear the fragility behind it. He reached for her hand, holding it gently in his. "Yes. They will. I'll make sure of it. I wish I had more time," she said. "I want to see them grow up. Graduate. Fall in love. I want to be there for everything." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she turned her face slightly away, trying to compose herself. Andrew didn't speak right away. He knew there was nothing he could say that wouldn't feel hollow in comparison to what she was losing. Instead, he leaned closer and said quietly, "They'll carry you with them. Every step. I'll make sure they know your strength. Your love. Your story." That night marked a shift between them. There was no longer hesitation or resentment. There was trust, deep and complete, built not from grand declarations, but from the days and weeks Andrew had quietly shown her that he was different now, that he was worthy of being part of this family. Their conversations turned practical. Hannah asked him to learn how to do the girls' hair properly. She gave him access to all the doctor's notes, the medications, the names of teachers, and the girls' favorite foods. She started telling him small things she had never thought to write down, what scared Luna when it thundered, how Lily liked to sleep with the window cracked open, which songs they loved to dance to when they were sick. One afternoon, when Hannah was too tired to get out of bed, Andrew helped the girls bake cookies. The kitchen turned into a mess of flour and sticky dough, but the joy in the room was undeniable. They called it Mommy's Cookie Day, and promised to do it again the next week. Hannah sat at the table wrapped in a blanket, watching them with tears in her eyes, not from sadness, but from the sheer beauty of the life happening in front of her, a life she had created and protected, and now, a life she was handing over with trembling but willing hands. There were quiet moments, too, where Andrew would find the girls playing by themselves, whispering to their stuffed animals about how they were going to keep Mommy happy or how Daddy said they could make a fort in the living room. He listened from the hallway, his heart swelling and breaking all at once. It was in those small, stolen moments that he realized how deeply they had accepted him, not as a replacement, not as a visitor, but as their father. By the end of January, the walls of the apartment were covered with drawings, school projects, and new memories. There were photos of the four of them, some posed, most candid, laughing, hugging, existing in a world they never thought they'd have. Hannah smiled in every picture, even the ones where she looked the weakest. She wanted the girls to remember her smiling. And Andrew, for the first time in his life, no longer felt haunted by the man he used to be. He had spent years chasing success and escaping vulnerability, but now, sitting beside a woman he once abandoned and helping raise two daughters he never expected, he finally understood the only legacy that mattered was love, and the courage to show up for it, again and again, no matter how late. Spring arrived slowly, thawing the snow-covered streets and bringing a gentle warmth that crept through the windows of the small apartment. The first blooms outside signaled a change, not just in the season but in the rhythm of their lives. For weeks, Hannah's health had hovered at the edge, unpredictable and delicate. Every moment felt like it might be the last, yet she held on longer than anyone expected, her will tethered tightly to the girls' laughter, their joy, and the comfort of knowing they were no longer alone. Andrew had begun to believe that maybe she would stay, maybe not forever, but longer than the doctors had said. But some truths arrive gently, and others arrive all at once. Her body, despite its fight, was no longer capable of continuing the battle. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning. The sun was just starting to pour through the curtains, painting golden streaks on the bedroom walls. The girls were still asleep, curled against each other in their shared bed. Andrew had just finished making coffee when he realized he hadn't heard Hannah stir. He brought her tea like he always did and walked quietly to her room. She looked peaceful, her head resting slightly to the side, a soft smile still etched into her face. But something felt different. Her chest didn't rise with breath. Her fingers were still. He stood there for a moment, unable to accept what he already knew. Then he sat beside her and took her hand in his, whispering her name once, twice, as if the sound of his voice might anchor her to this world just a little longer. But she was gone. What followed were the hardest hours of Andrew's life. He called Margaret first, unable to form full sentences. She came immediately and took care of everything he couldn't, making calls, soothing the girls when they awoke and asked where Mommy was, holding them as they cried into her shoulder. Andrew sat on the floor of the bedroom for a long time, still holding Hannah's hand, overwhelmed not just by grief, but by awe. He had known her in so many versions, young and passionate, angry and hurt, resilient and kind. And in the end, she had given him the most impossible gift, her trust, her forgiveness, and the love of the daughters they shared. The funeral was small, just family and a few close friends. The girls wore white dresses and carried lilies. Andrew spoke, not with practiced words, but from a heart that had finally learned to break open. He spoke of the woman who had raised their daughters with strength and grace. He spoke of mistakes and second chances, and how Hannah had taught him that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about showing up for the future. In the months that followed, the apartment grew quieter, but never empty. Lily and Luna filled it with music, laughter, and questions that only a child could ask. Margaret stayed often, helping where she could, but Andrew took on everything else, not as a burden, but as a privilege. He learned to do hair with ribbons. He packed snacks with care. He helped them through nightmares and stage fright, through skinned knees and picture days. He became not just their father, but their world. One summer evening, as they sat on the balcony eating popsicles, Luna looked up at him and asked, "Are you still sad about Mommy?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Yes, but it's a different kind of sad now. It's full of love, not pain." Lily leaned against his shoulder. "Mommy said you'd take care of us." He kissed the top of her head. "And I always will." Years later, the drawing still hung on the walls, faded but intact. The bedtime stories grew more complex. The girls stopped needing help brushing their teeth, but they never stopped asking him to check the closet for monsters. They still celebrated Mommy's Cookie Day once a month. And every time they sang, danced, or laughed too hard, Andrew swore he could still feel Hannah's presence, soft, proud, and at peace. Love had not erased their loss, but it had filled in the empty spaces. It had created a home where there had once been brokenness. And through that love, Andrew had become something more than a father. He had become the man Hannah had once believed he could be. The girls called him Daddy every day, not out of habit, but because he had earned the name through every moment he stayed when it was hardest. Through every whispered promise he kept. Through every morning he showed up, simply and fully, with love. The ending of this story carries the kind of emotional weight that doesn't scream, it lingers. It's not about a perfect redemption arc or a neatly tied-up happy ending. It's about growth born out of grief, and love that takes root after pain has done its damage. Andrew's transformation isn't instant or cinematic, it's slow, quiet, and deeply human. That's what makes it believable. He doesn't become a hero because he swoops in to fix everything. He becomes one because he chooses to stay, to face the consequences of who he was, and to build something better, not for himself, but for the daughters who gave him a second chance without even knowing it. Hannah's departure doesn't feel like a tragedy, it feels like a passage. Her story ends not in silence, but in trust. She let go because she knew the girls would be loved. That kind of peace is rare, and it's earned. And the girls? They are the living proof that even in the wreckage of broken relationships, something beautiful and lasting can grow. It's a story that reminds us, people change, but only when they choose to. And when they do, truly, wholeheartedly, the ripples of that change can heal not just one life, but generations.